that de Klerk is honest and he really wants to bring change, and it's only third undefinable forces that are otherwise undermining the very good intentions that de Klerk wants to do. And I think that has actually caused problems in terms of our own strategy as the ANC in terms of how we deal with the violence. Now, also about peace agreements is that because we signed the agreement with Inkatha on January 29, 1991, we tend to be very reluctant to actually expose what Inkatha is doing. And also we become very reluctant to analyze Inkatha for what it is. Let me give an example from the Natal Midlands, for instance, how Inkatha uses these peace agreements to try and hide its own atrocities against the people. They try to attack a particular area, and then the comrades are able to repel them, and then they go to the press and they actually say that the ANC has ambushed Inkatha people who were from a peace rally that was reporting back on the January 29 meeting. A very fine, nice story. When we start responding to the press and raising this, then we meet at the level of what is called the 12-a-side structure that was created between Inkatha and ourselves in January 29. Then they start saying, but why did you go to the press on this? Why did you go to the press on that? Because we should have not gone to the press, but just come and discuss this in this structure. So these structures for Inkatha, they want also to use them as a means to hide away its own atrocities. As if we expose what it is doing, then we are breaking the agreement. I think the one thing also that we'd like to talk about around peace agreements are local peace initiatives. That whilst local peace initiatives can actually help to contain the violence, but they can have the problem that Inkatha makes a peace agreement in one area, and then it uses that as a breather actually to attack the next area. And in some instances, this has caused problems because one branch of the ANC enters into an agreement with Inkatha, and Inkatha warlords from that area start attacking the adjacent branch. And then it starts creating problems within our own organization. Now, in conclusion then, comrades, in terms of some of the issues that we need to be looking at, we need to be looking primarily really at a very serious program of action around which to end the violence, which then takes us to the question of mass action in relation to negotiations, and also looking specifically within that at much more forceful ways of putting our point across. Unless we develop a program of action to deal with the violence, we are going to flounder. Unless we do a very thorough self-criticism in the way that we have actually handled the violence, there are actually going to be problems. And also lastly, when we have resolved that there shall be defense units and that has not happened, we need at this commission to look very concretely, because that's not the only thing, but it's a very key part of our strategy of how do we ensure that those defense units are there. And those defense units should not be carrying stones or anything. We should also be carrying the very same sophisticated weaponry that the enemy is carrying.
Violence has been going on. December 1987, UDF and COSATU tried to find a solution to this violence by entering into agreements with Inkatha. Who reneged? It was not COSATU and UDF. Let us look at the role of the state. All those who were meeting to discuss the question of violence were rounded up and thrown behind bars into detention. People wanted peace, and it was a crime to seek peace. And the warlords continued with their work, with their carnage, with their massacre, with their murders. Then, what did he do after that? We entered into more peace agreements, peace initiatives. A very good thing, because every one of us wants peace. The fact that we call on the security forces to stop attacks on the people is because we want people to live peacefully. Because we want peace, we say the warlords must be arrested. Because we want to pursue our activities peacefully. But we ever get that? We do not. Because we have lost track of the essentials of our own revolution. That is the situation, Comrade Chairman. I only wish that those who are affected, who are involved in this violence, would be the people to discuss their own fate. What do they do? You mentioned the massacre, the so-called Gwashanga massacre, when in Qatar, loaded in buses, went there to attack the people. And the people gallantly defended themselves. Killed more than 18 of the attackers, the warlords, and their men. What did our NEC say? We condemn the massacre. In other words, we're condemned for defending ourselves. I can assure this conference, when you talk of people who just talk war, the Natal Midlands, people who don't want peace. I was asked if I've ever gone to David Ntombela to shake hands with him. I'll be the last man to do that. Moy River, almost 4 weeks ago, David Ntombela was there conducting his armies, which murdered our people. Not a word from our own organization saying, here is the man of peace, because Ntombela is called now Peace Lord. As I'm speaking to you, he lives in a motel just next to Moy River, conducting operations there against our own people. They carry all assortment of weapons. But what do? We say it is violence. It's not a war of liberation on its low intensity. We say it's violence. Once you give it this description, once you give it this epithet, then what are you expected to do? You are expected to get all the priests with their Bibles to come and sing hosannas in order that there be peace on earth. You are not saying, here is a war of liberation, and the enemy is waging violent war on us. And therefore, we must not only call on our people as we do to defend themselves, but we must make it possible that they defend themselves. We always talk, defense committees, defend yourself. This what? Yes, I was in Lusikisik one day, and the chairman of the branch there said, we don't want you to take sticks here and use them to defend yourselves because we are running short of firewood. We want those sticks to cook our food with. And he says we are running short of building material here because you take stones and use them for fighting. Therefore, houses and roads. Get guns and defend yourselves. We talk about guns. We talk about MK. But you say, no, it's a crime. You'll pollute the atmosphere of negotiations.
We therefore resolve, 1, to support the current peace initiative of the church and business leaders in developing a code of conduct for the security forces, developing a code of conduct for the political organizations, developing an enforcement mechanism to monitor the codes that will involve a wide range of political groupings. Also developing a program of reconstruction. We resolve also to continue exploring ways of enabling our people to defend themselves and to take definite steps to provide all possible resources and assistance for the establishment of self-defense units in areas affected by the violence. Resolving also to embark on a program of national mass action within the context of our demands for the removal of all obstacles to creating a climate for negotiations, and also within the context of our demands for the dismantling of all apartheid structures, and also within the context of our demands for an interim government and a constituent assembly. We resolve to embark on a publicity campaign both locally and internationally to expose the true nature of the violence. To resolve, lastly, to establish structures on a branch, regional and national level with our partners within the Tripartite Alliance and other democratic formations to coordinate our strategies in responding to the violence.
In the entering into of peace pacts, it is the counter-revolutionary character of the organizations which we have entered into peace pacts with, namely Inkatha, has not been presented. Too often, Inkatha has been presented as a fraternal organization, and our resolution has to make it clear that Inkatha is not a fraternal organization of the African National Congress. I would like to insert a clause which says, all contacts with representatives of such counter-revolutionary forces as are mentioned in this resolution should be in a manner befitting such forces and be handled in such a way as to clearly show that we do not regard the instigators of violence as our friends or allies.
We of the rural areas, especially the Northern Transvaal, where most of these Bantustan are located, are worried about the fact that it seems that the violence is being categorized as emanating from the IFP only. But it seems to us that every time that the so-called allies of ours in the Bantustans, whenever they are from meeting our national NEC or from meeting with the RECs, they come up with some program of action against the very same members of the African National Congress. So it perturbs us to see that this thing is missing from the resolution. I wonder if something could be done about it in the resolution.
I don't think that it would be proper to simply just draft a resolution, present it to conference as if we have no other resolution when we have a resolution from the consultative conference. And also I thought it would be proper also to get some kind of report. I know that comrades normally say, well, you can't report openly on defense units. On the one hand, I accept that, but on the other hand, it can become a very handy excuse for not doing anything about this matter. And I think that it is very important that we do get some kind of feedback from the NEC as to what has been done about this particular matter, in order also to try and connect our resolution from the consultative conference and the resolution that we are likely to take from this particular conference. I think also in the resolution, or this conference should look at the question of deadlines in terms of doing certain things, like this matter of defense units in particular, that we don't just say we will strive to do this and we don't give ourselves some kind of deadlines that such and such will have to be done by such and such a time. Thank you, Comrade Chair.
Already last December, the question of self-defense units was placed on our agenda. The problem is that that was not implemented. And here we are, more than 6 months later, with many bodies lying along the road, and our organization has done nothing to see to the establishment of the self-defense units. So we cannot expect and we cannot accept, comrades, that we must now go to see to the exploring of this question. The question of Isibam is one thing, and Comrade Harry has dealt with that. We here can't address it, comrades. But what we can address, what we must address immediately, is to go to our people and show them the way to organize the structures at the community level. And those structures are of self-protection units,
So, Comrade Chair, I'm saying that the ANC must take responsibility for the implementation of such a plan. Okay.
After taking into account the concerns of the delegates, the draft resolution on violence was adopted with a few amendments. The new National Executive Committee was elected after the performance of each candidate was put under the microscope at branch and regional levels. An independent electoral commission ensured that elections were free and fair and that they were properly conducted by secret ballot.
The persons who voted were all duly accredited delegates. The voting was conducted fairly and the ballot was secret. Counting was accurate. The Electoral Commission has reported that it is satisfied that free and fair elections were conducted for all positions, and the results which have been announced and which I will now announce are in accordance with the secret ballots that were conducted. As you know, yesterday you resolved unanimously to elect Comrade Oliver Tambo to the position of National Chairman of the ANC. There was only one candidate for the position of President. No ballot was necessary, and I accordingly take great pleasure in announcing the election of Comrade Nelson Mandela to the post of President.
Results of the 50 successful candidates
and foremost, strategy and tactics. Supposed to be a document that contains the broad guidelines of movement policy. It is not supposed to be a program of action, but should create a basis upon which programs of action can be developed on an ongoing basis. It is supposed to create or to indicate the broad parameters within which the day-to-day work of the movement can be conducted. Secondly, strategy and tactics is supposed to be a document that discusses the fundamental policy of the movement, which would then affect the deployment of resources within the movement. Thirdly, strategy and tactics is supposed to be relatively timeless. We cannot have a kind of strategy and tactics that becomes outdated in a week or in a year's time. That is why it has to be as broad as possible. And therefore, in our own discussion, we'll have to agree how timeless or what kind of time span is this strategy and tactics supposed to cover. And broadly, what is proposed in the draft, as you should know, is that it covers what broadly is called a period of transition. Lastly, people have stated over and over again that the situation in which we are is not completely irreversible. And therefore, there are possibilities that we might have to revert to forms of struggle that we were using in the past. And the question has always arisen, do we want in our strategy and tactics to elaborate on those forms of struggle that we might have to resort to? Or do those kinds of formulations belong somewhere else? We're talking now about the strengths and weaknesses of the liberation movement. The strategic goal that we pursue objectively serves the interests of the majority within society, promotes peace amongst the people, and that gives us the moral and political strength. And the path of peaceful transition that we have decided upon now enjoys the support of the overwhelming majority within society. Even amongst people who might disagree with the policies of the ANC, they believe that there should be peaceful political contest, free political activity. But we say that morality on its own does not shape the strength of an organization. In the final analysis, our power resides in the masses. They possess the means to bring pressure to bear on the ruling bloc, and if you give them skillful leadership, they're able to act effectively and ensure that we move forward as fast as possible. And we identify our weaknesses in the positive sense more as subjective weaknesses. The objective ones being in inverse as compared to the regime, we do not have the resources that it has. Be it financial, be it military, be it propaganda-wise and so on. We do not have those resources. But the subjective problems would arise from the question whether we're able to use our strengths in order to ensure that we shift the balance of forces. This would entail the capacity to organize and mobilize the people, our ability to lead not only our members and supporters, but society as a whole. So that ultimately, it's a question of whether we're able subjectively to use our strengths. And if you have got the right to complain about lack of resources, this is not the cause of our major weakness. It simply compounds our weakness. The main cause is whether we're able to use our strengths to our own advantage. We're saying also another strength of the state is that because the ruling class in its totality is united on their strategic perspective, then most elements, either wittingly or unwittingly, amongst these forces, avail their resources to the regime, especially during crisis moments. And therefore, you find them presenting almost a total united front against the democratic movement and the ANC in particular. But we are saying that it has got many, many weaknesses. The first one is that the apartheid system is in general crisis, political and economic, and the regime cannot deal with this crisis in its totality. Secondly, the regime craves for credibility amongst our people and internationally. And therefore, it wants to be seen to be negotiating and reaching agreements. And that constitutes another weakness on the part of the regime, which we can exploit. Thirdly, the regime, in trying to form alliances within the black community, it finds itself having to identify with forces which are thoroughly discredited within their own communities. Fourthly, there are many forces which were schooled in anti-ANC propaganda before we were unbanned. But now that we are here, able to intervene directly, they are able from first-hand experience to make a rational choice. And this would, depending on what work we do, include elements within the security forces, Bantustan forces, and so on and so forth.
There are two extremes. At one level, there's a feeling that we should go on as we've been going on over the years, struggling in an old way, so to say. And there's another extreme, which seeks to characterize the situation, to argue as if we're in a post-apartheid society. I think what needs to be done really is to properly characterize the situation as is, and begin to give the overall direction. If you look, for instance, at the civic movement, which used to get direction from the movement in general terms, today is left in a limbo in a sense. They are seeking their own identity and a lot of confusion.
Comrade, I suggest that our strategic option has not as yet changed. Our strategic option is still the transfer of power to our people, to transform our society, which has all the contradictions of capitalism at the moment, into a society based on justice towards socialism. I think in broad terms that is our strategic objective. But what we do not need to lose sight of is the fact that the balance of forces both externally and internally have changed. And then in determining our tactics, we have got to take into consideration the alteration of forces externally, that is internationally, and nationally. That in doing so, we do not lose sight of the fact that all our successes, which we need to consolidate, have been the successes of our people. So that in essence, the masses of our people, whether internally or the mobilization of forces against apartheid South Africa externally, are the successes of our people.
I think there is some confusion about about the fact that we had previously spoken about the seizure of power, and we now talk predominantly about the transfer of power. I think there is confusion about whether it's just semantics, playing with words, or whether it's in fact indicative of the approach which has changed, and I think we need to clarify that in this discussion. Otherwise, in terms of ourselves, maybe first in terms of the state, I think what one clearly identifies is that the state will change its own objectives, its own tactics and its strategies, not only in relation to itself, but also in relation to us, to the liberation movement. And I want to posit the argument that in fact there has been a clear shift between Groote Schuur and Pretoria in terms of how the state related to us, where, to put it very crudely, during Groote Schuur there was an approach where they wanted to go for co-managing jointly with the ANC the period of transition because of our own organizational weaknesses and obviously their own interventions to weaken us even further. They have now deemed fit and necessary to in fact go for dividing the ANC, smashing the ANC, and in fact building something very separate in competition to the ANC. I think we need to understand what it is when we talk about the fact that circumstances have changed quite dramatically in our country. Can we say that we have entered into a period of transition? Does the changed circumstances in fact mean that we are in a transitionary phase? How does that definition of transition relate to questions of the obstacles? How does it relate to the question of the irreversibility of change? Because it affects things like the sanctions debate, it affects things like our attitude to interim governments, and I think that that's another issue which we have to clarify here in terms of our own perspective when we go back to the conference.
We need to be clear about the circumstances that we now operate in. Those circumstances say to us that we have not yet entered a period of transition. Transition must surely be related to the question of power in the hands of the people. The fundamental question of sovereignty. Where does sovereignty vest? And what is the point of transfer of sovereignty? And I want to suggest, dear Comrade Chair, that the beginning of that process is the point of an interim government. And therefore, to talk about a period of transition now misses the point. You cannot have transition until there is a sense of the shift of power in a very real way. A shift of control and a shift of control over all of the forces and state apparatus.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. On the question of our strategic perspective, through struggle we have brought the regime almost to the point of a negotiating table. And it is our duty and responsibility to ensure that the process of negotiations continue in an uninterrupted manner. In pushing the negotiations forward, we rely not on our skill as negotiators. We rely not on propaganda alone. that what we would rely on at all times is our capacity to mobilize a mass uprising. That without that capacity, it is impossible for us to ensure that negotiations end up in a logical and satisfactory conclusion. I'm not saying that we need to relaunch or unsuspend the armed struggle. But what I'm saying nonetheless is that we need to nurture and build that capacity which we have been doing over the past 10 or 15 years. And that is the capacity to unleash a mass uprising. And such an uprising would not make sense if we are unable at all times to be able to inject an armed component into that mass uprising. And this requires of us to nurture all the pillars of our struggle, all 4 pillars of the struggle. We need to ensure that we have an army and that we build an army, not for the purposes of combat at this point in time, but for the purposes of injecting an armed component into a mass uprising if that is needed. Without that sort of capacity, there is no reason why the regime should not stall negotiations. There is no reason why the regime should not become intransigent on the question of a constituent assembly or any of the other key questions that face us.
I think, one, the situation demands, comrades, that we radically move because the conditions have altered. We move from the old concepts with regards to armed struggle, our perspective of armed struggle. I think we must move completely away from that formulation of 1969 Morocco struggle, a Morocco Conference on Strategy and Tactics, and completely, this concept of a protracted struggle with rear bases outside and the possibility of comrades still entertaining some idea of returning to the bush. I think the movement has got to do a serious thinking on this question of how now do we see the new perspective, the role of military in under these new conditions and the way forward. I'm discussing this question in relation to the statement which was made to this position that we are still a national liberation movement which is still committed to transfer of power. And it is very dangerous. It's fundamentally important for any national liberation movement committed to question of seizure of power to give serious attention to military questions.
The Strategy and Tactics Commission met under rather difficult conditions. Some 500 people took part. In spite of this large number, about 200 people contributed verbally, and many others gave written communications as to what they wanted in this final report. There was a very high level of contributions, consequent, I think, on the extensive discussions that there have been in preparation for the conference. In the short time available to us, it's not been possible to provide an elaborate document of the Morogoro type. We've not aimed at that, we've merely aimed at a resolution. Also, I think there would have been a bit more stirring ending, a bit more of threats towards the government and so forth if we had a bit more time.
to the leadership of the ANC at all levels. But in terms of its day-to-day operations, the command of MK will take full charge of those operations.
Comrade Chairman, we must raise the point that until now, a number of MK comrades have or do constitute part of the security of the offices of the ANC. But they do so with jungle knives. Shouldn't we add there that the NEC should engage the regime and secure the right for these comrades who act in these capacities to actually do so with recognized weaponry?
Terra, the task given to you from my side is to write that amendment as soon as possible and submit it to us.
My question is on the armed struggle suspended and not abandoned, and the MK protecting our people. But day to day, we have our people molested, killed in the trains, in the buses, in the houses. What protection and what assurance have we got from MK that we can go back to our people and say we have the protection and defense from the MK? Thank you, sir.
The problem of violence was discussed when the Violence Commission presented its report. There were allusions to the whole issue of self-defense units. I'm not going to give any assurance. It's part of our responsibility, together with the ANC and community organizations, to make sure that these self-defense units are organized as soon as possible.
Comrade Chair, I move that the paragraph should be deleted.
Yeah.
In my view, Comrade Chair, it is in direct violation of the spirit of the agreement of DF Malan, in which the ANC agreed that it will undertake a phased-out depletion of the underground structures. And it is my belief that at this stage of our struggle, the army's pivot and hinges on the underground. And this sentence, in light of the agreements existing now, seems to not make much sense to me.
Does anybody want to reply to that? Yes, Comrade Tenjua.
Our argument, Comrade Chair, is that MK, the ANC and MK are unbanned, and therefore MK can have structures, recognized structures. And the second aspect is that within the movement, if MK does not have recognized structures, it cannot operate effectively. And therefore it needs, for the sake of operating effectively and for the sake of pursuing its program of action and the orders that we are going to receive from this conference, we need structures and offices. There is no implication of underground.
One of the most important obstacles to negotiation is the release of political prisoners. We have been handling this matter with the government since the first summit in May last year. As far as the political prisoners outside the homeless. There are 19 of them who were sentenced for murder. And the government took up the attitude that these could not be released because they fell outside the definition of a political prisoner, as was decided at Grooteskiel. We rejected that contention and pointed out that any offense which was politically motivated makes the person who committed that offense a political prisoner. The government has now accepted that position. Of the 19 political prisoners still remaining in terms of this definition, these prisoners were released today. This conference has reflected the shifts we have made in our own organization and the transformation from a banned illegal formation to a mass-based and democratic organization. And this conference has also reflected the amount of work we have to do to consolidate our policies amongst all the people in this country. We have achieved an important milestone in our history, and that is the merging of the different strands of our organization. Because of the enthusiasm that has been shown here, I do not consider it necessary to go into details about our achievements. But perhaps it is necessary for me just to say in very brief outline that the ANC in this country continues to hold the strategic initiative. And those people who say that the initiative has passed on to Mr. de Klerk are just giving vent to their own wishes. The government, during the last 40 years, has told the country and the world that the solution to the problems of this country was the policy of apartheid, in which blacks would continue to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. On the contrary, we announced a non-racial policy. We announced that we were and still are fighting for a democratic South Africa, molded on the principle of one person, one vote. The government has now admitted that they were wrong. We were right. Even on the question of sanctions, where they say sanctions are crumbling, that may be true, but they are exaggerating the matter. They do not tell us that the decision taken by the EEC in December last year to lift sanctions on gold coins coal and iron ore. Those sanctions cannot be implemented because of the decision of the Danish Parliament. And that decision, on the authority of Jacques Delors, the president of the EC, to whom I spoke about 3 weeks ago, on his authority, that decision cannot be carried out until the Danish Parliament changes its decision. In conclusion, comrades, we are very happy indeed to have had such a successful conference. We are happy about the contributions that you made, the criticism, the constructive criticisms that you have brought forward. The leadership must listen to the membership, because we are here to serve the membership and our people. But you must also listen to us. We want you to know that you yourselves, whether you are on the national executive or not, on the regional executive committee, on the branch executive committee or not, you, as a member of the ANC, are a leader in your own name and right. And it is in that spirit that we address you. It is in that spirit that we will listen to your criticism and your suggestions. And if you do that, there is no doubt that the road to union buildings and Dane Hayes has become all the shorter.
We, participants in this 48th National Conference of the ANC, representing a cross-section of South African society, workers, students, the rural masses, intellectuals, religious communities, business persons, men and women, young and old, black and white, hereby adopt this declaration as our collective message to our country and to the world. This 48th National Conference of the ANC comes at a time when our country and its people are poised to commence the last leg of our long struggle to bring an end to minority domination and to usher in an era of democracy and peace. We reaffirm our unambiguous commitment to exploring every possible avenue to resolve by peaceful means the problems of our country. We note with alarm the continuation of vigilante violence perpetrated by agencies of the state against black communities. We refuse to submit to the temptations of despair induced by the enemies of democracy, justice and peace, who have over the past 18 months subjected our country to unprecedented level of violence and bloodletting with a view to derailing the search for peace and postponing indefinitely the establishment of a democratic, non-racial state. We remain committed to the call for an interim government and a constituent assembly elected on the basis of one person, one vote, on a non-racial voters' roll. We, together with a majority of South Africans, are committed to the advancement of the struggle within the context of the new situation. We are conscious of the heavy responsibility on the African National Congress and the people in general to ensure that this takes place with a minimum of bloodshed and destruction. We pledge to march together in ever-swelling ranks to a united, non-racial, non-sexist and democratic South Africa. Let peace, freedom and justice prevail.